The rack is one of the most infamous torture devices in history, often associated with medieval Europe, but its conceptual roots go back to ancient Greece and Rome. While the exact design of the later medieval rack may not have existed in these ancient civilizations, the fundamental method of stretching the body as a means of torture was definitely employed. The rack in ancient Greece. The rack was known in a primitive form called the scavenger's daughter, or similar to the tympanum. This was a kind of wooden frame or drum used to bind and stretch a prisoner's limbs. The victim would be fastened with cords, then pulled and twisted until joints dislocated. Public use. Torture in Greece was generally used on slaves, foreigners, and non-citizens, not on full citizens. The belief was that slaves could not be trusted to tell the truth unless forced. Legal torture. Greek law even required slaves to be tortured for their testimony to be admissible in court. This process was called basanos, meaning both torture and truth test. The rack-type stretching was typically used in conjunction with flogging, burning, or mutilation to extract confessions or information. The rack in ancient Rome. The Romans refined many Greek methods and added their own brutal innovations. Equuleus, little horse. The Roman version of the rack was called the Equuleus. It consisted of a wooden frame on which the victim was laid out. Then limbs were slowly stretched by rollers or pulleys. Sometimes the limbs were tied to ropes pulled by turning spindles. Use on slaves and enemies. Like in Greece, it was legally allowed primarily for slaves and criminals, not Roman citizens, unless under extraordinary circumstances, like treason. Cicero and other Roman writers describe the Equuleus as a symbol of extreme judicial cruelty. Roman emperors such as Caligula and Nero were infamous for using or endorsing such torture. Nero supposedly watched with pleasure as victims were stretched until their joints snapped. Techniques and effects. Process. The victim was bound by the wrists and ankles. Rollers would then be used to gradually pull the arms and legs in opposite directions. Pain and damage. Ligaments would tear, muscles would snap, and bones could dislocate or break. In extreme cases, the body was literally pulled apart. Psychological torture. The threat of the rack was often enough to force confessions, and it was sometimes used in stages, a few turns each day to prolong suffering. The rack's evolution into the medieval torture rack came during the Inquisition and was more mechanical. But the foundational idea came from Greek and Roman practices. Writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny the Elder mention such devices, showing how integral they were to Roman judicial and punitive practices. Exploring specific examples, the philosophical and legal views on torture in Greece and Rome, and the decline and legacy of rack-based torture in antiquity. Notable examples of use: 1. The case of Philotas, Alexander the Great's general, 330 BCE. Background: accused of conspiracy, Philotas was subjected to torture to extract confessions. Method: ancient historians suggest that stretching devices were used during interrogation, along with beating and starvation. Outcome: under torture, he confessed, whether true or not, and was executed. His father, Parmenion, was also killed as a precaution. The case of Gavius, Roman period. Described by Cicero, Gavius was a Roman citizen falsely accused of escaping slavery in Sicily, tortured with the Equuleus by the governor Verres, violating the law that protected citizens. Importance: Cicero used this case in his speech In Verum to denounce the illegal use of torture and humiliation of a citizen. Philosophical and legal views. Greek views. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle discussed torture with skepticism. Plato believed that tortured testimony was inherently unreliable, as people might say anything to stop pain. Despite this, courts still demanded basanos for slaves, valuing confessions gained under pain over their verbal testimony. Roman views. Cicero, 1st century BCE, was a strong opponent of torture, especially on citizens, famously saying, "Tormentis et cruciatibus civem Romanum adficere nefas est." To torture a Roman citizen is an abomination. However, torture was embedded in the legal framework, not for guilt, but often for evidence extraction. Roman law allowed torture, quaestio, on slaves, prisoners of war, and lower-class criminals. Decline in antiquity, with the rise of Christianity in the eye. Late Roman Empire, some thinkers began to challenge torture more vocally. Constantine the Great, 4th century CE, limited torture in some cases, though it never fully disappeared. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, judicial torture decreased temporarily before re-emerging in medieval Europe. Legacy and influence. The medieval rack used during the Inquisition in Tudor England was a technologically refined version of the Roman Equuleus. Its symbolic power carried over centuries. A tool not just for pain, but for control, fear, and forced obedience. The rack influenced later regimes including Byzantine, Islamic courts under certain rulers, and medieval European tribunals.